Sometimes the words that we have at Mass from the Scriptures can take a little bit of deciphering. Sometimes as a person who's supposed to come up with a homily, it takes several readings of the readings before a message kind of comes forth. Or sometimes Jesus' words may seem mysterious or in need of breakdown. But then there are certain weeks where we have a gospel passage like we have today, where Jesus is simply very straightforward in offering us suggestion and advice about how we should interact with each other as fellow human beings. And actually we hear an echo of Jesus' advice all the way back in the first reading as well, from the prophet Jeremiah. In that reading, we hear God telling the prophet Jeremiah, you ought to be speaking to people. Do not hold back. Do not be silent. And indeed, I think that's Jesus' advice as well in the gospel. Do not be silent. I think what he's ultimately encouraging us in a very direct way is engage in conversation. Engage your fellow human being. If you are in a relationship with someone, talk to them. Do not be silent. And indeed, that is the advice I think that we hear from people from all across the spectrum of our world today. If anybody agrees on anything in terms of the mental health profession or psychologists, priests, and people of all faith denominations, you hear it even on daytime talk shows and advice shows. We have to be people who communicate. We have to be people who talk to each other. Jesus is trying to get us over the temptation to simply be silent. To simply be silent. And why is that a temptation? I think silence in a relationship is tempting because in the short term it's easy. It's easier than having to go and engage another person in conversation or dialogue, especially someone who we're close to and may have a problem with. It's easier to remain silent because if we remain silent again in the short term, we avoid conflict. And we as middle-class Americans love to be kind and nice. And so the opportunity to avoid uncomfortableness or conflict in a relationship sometimes causes us to avoid communicating and talking to our fellow people that we are in relationship with. And Jesus again is trying to say, go talk to those people that you are in a relationship with. If it's your spouse, if it's your friend, if it's people that are in your life at work, whatever it may be, talk to them. If there are problems or things that come up, not if there are problems, we should say when there are problems. Because as human beings involved in relationships, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. When those problems come into our lives, we have to be people who engage. Silence ultimately doesn't work. We think a lot of times, well, I'll be quiet for a long time until the other person figures out what I want. If I simply sit here and be quiet, the other person, through mental vibrations or ESP or whatever it is, will figure out that I want the car washed, or will figure out that I want the dishwasher unloaded, and I'll simply sit here with my arms crossed. The problem is that never works because no one knows what our silence means except for us. Someone can be silent and could be completely joyful, or someone could be silent and could be boiling over inside with anger. We never know. That's the problem with silence, and that's the thing that Jesus is trying to get us to understand. If we really love the other person, as St. Paul asks us to, then we will talk to them, and we will engage with them even if it's difficult. As I gave this homily last night and went home and watched about 15 minutes of the Notre Dame game, which has been for about the last 5 years about how long I've been curious about Notre Dame's season. About 15 minutes. Unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be another long year, but nevertheless, I was thinking about this homily and I was watching the game, and literally after every play, they would cut back to the head coach, and his face was red, and he was screaming, and there were veins popping out all over his forehead and neck and everything else. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, well, his method could probably use a little bit of tweaking, but at least his players know where he stands. They know what he wants them to do. If the coach was just standing over there quietly when things were going wrong, then you would really be worried. That would probably be a sign that he, in fact, didn't care anymore. And so while obviously Jesus is not asking us to engage with one another through screaming, through the way that Coach Kelly was talking to his players last night, Jesus is, and the Scriptures, the Old Testament, are all asking us to do the same thing, to care enough, to respect the other person enough, to actually talk to them, even if it's difficult, even if it involves short-term pain. Again, because Jesus was human himself and still is. And in his humanity, he knows what really works for us and what is only a short-term patch. Who is it in your life today, in this church, in this community, in your home, in your extended family, in your circle of friends, in your group of co-workers at work? Who is it that you know you need to say something to, but you haven't for a while?